It was one of those rare weekends where my mum was away on a business trip and dad was left in charge of the house. It was supposed to be a typical few days where we just hung out, watched movies, and ordered pizza like we always did when mum wasn't around. But that weekend ended up being a turning point in my life, one I could never have anticipated. I was 17 at the time, old enough to understand relationships, but still naive to the complexities that often lay beneath the surface. That weekend, my dad, whom I had always seen as the calm, reliable one, began acting strangely. He seemed more distant, distracted. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was just busy with work. But on the second day, something strange happened. I found a series of texts on my dad's phone while he was in the shower. The messages weren't just casual, they were intimate, filled with longing and promises from someone I didn't recognize. My heart raced, and I felt a rush of disbelief. I had seen these kinds of texts before, on my friends' phones, when they were caught up in the mess of secret relationships and hidden emotions. It took me hours to process what I had seen. When I finally confronted my dad, he didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, like he had been waiting for the moment I would catch on. The person he was texting was not some random stranger. It was his colleague, a woman he'd worked with for years. He confessed that he had been seeing her for months. The emotional connection was undeniable, and he said he had never intended for me or Mom to find out. What followed was a conversation that shook me to my core. I tried to reconcile the image of my loving father with the man standing in front of me, confessing to infidelity. He explained that over the years he had grown emotionally distant from Mum, feeling neglected and disconnected. He said that the affair had given him the emotional intimacy he had been craving, and he had convinced himself that it was harmless, just a way to fill a void. The most painful part, however, wasn't just the betrayal, it was the fact that, in a way, I understood the loneliness he felt. I could see how the emotional gap had formed in his relationship with my mom, how time and complacency had chipped away at their connection. But the secret, the lies, the lack of respect for our family, it tore me apart. How could he, someone I admired, be capable of such a betrayal? The next few days were a blur. I didn't tell my mom. I couldn't bear to break her heart, and I didn't know how to even begin explaining what had happened. I kept it inside, trying to act normal around both of them, even though everything felt wrong. The emotional weight was unbearable. I was caught in the middle of a family drama that wasn't mine to solve. Eventually, my mom found out on her own. She had become suspicious when she noticed my dad's strange behavior, and, like me, discovered the truth in an unexpected way. The aftermath was heartbreaking. The emotional toll it took on our family was indescribable. My mom, devastated by the betrayal, tried to understand my dad's reasons, but the trust was gone. Their relationship was never the same, and the wounds lingered long after the affair had ended. Looking back, I realize how complicated emotions are in relationships. There's so much more than just love or loyalty. There's a complex web of needs, desires, and disappointments that often go unspoken. My dad's actions didn't just hurt my mum, they hurt me too. It made me question the integrity of relationships and how sometimes emotional neglect can lead people down paths they never thought they'd take. After my dad confessed, the entire house felt like it was shrouded in a thick fog of tension. The once lively family dinners became stiff and quiet, as though every word could trigger an explosion of emotions. I couldn't look at my dad the same way anymore. Every time I saw him, I felt an overwhelming mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness, but most of all, confusion. How could he do this to us? How could he do this to my mom, the woman who had given so much to our family? I had so many questions, but no answers. The hardest part was the silence that followed. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but I didn't know where to begin. Every time I thought about confronting him, I was paralyzed with fear, not just of him, but of the repercussions. What would happen if my mom found out? Would they break up? What about me? What role did I play in all of this? The emotional turmoil swirled inside me, but I kept it bottled up. I couldn't bear to share it with anyone, especially not my friends. They wouldn't understand, or worse, they'd judge me, just as I had judged my dad. I also realized that the affair wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of something deeper. It was the product of years of subtle neglect, unspoken resentments, and emotional distance that had grown between my parents. In their eyes, the affair was the culmination of years of frustration and unmet needs, both emotional and physical. My dad spoke about how he felt disconnected from my mom for years, how the daily grind of life had worn them both down, leaving them too tired or too busy to communicate properly. He admitted that their relationship had lost its spark, and he was too afraid to talk about it. Instead, he sought comfort in someone who was easy to talk to, someone who listened when he felt ignored at home. But the more he explained, the more I felt torn. On the one hand, I could understand the emotional void he had described. It wasn't that I excused his actions, but I could see how he justified them in his own mind. He was human after all. He wasn't a monster, just a man trying to cope with feelings of loneliness and neglect in a marriage that had slowly eroded over time. But on the other hand, the betrayal, the secrecy, and the utter lack of respect for my mom were impossible to reconcile. My dad's affair didn't just violate the sanctity of their marriage, it tore apart the foundation of trust that had held our family together. In some ways, it felt like he had betrayed me too. When my mom returned from her trip, everything changed. I watched her face as she pieced together the reality of what had been going on. She was heartbroken, not just because of the affair itself, but because of the years of emotional neglect she hadn't seen. She had sensed something was off, but the depth of the betrayal took her by surprise. I had hoped she wouldn't find out, that somehow the family could move on without facing the ugly truth. But in reality, it was impossible to ignore. The conversations that followed were painful. My mom and dad tried to talk about what had happened, but it was clear that the damage was too deep. They both had a long history of unresolved issues that had festered under the surface. The affair, though devastating, was only a symptom of the larger problem, a marriage that had stopped evolving, stopped communicating, and stopped caring. They were both emotionally attached to each other in ways that were more about obligation than love, a connection built on years of shared history rather than active care and attention.